Gary blinked. Pain shot through his head. His eyes, swollen shut, throbbed. He tasted blood, metallic and thick. Where was he? Darkness pressed in, heavy and absolute. He tried to remember, but his thoughts scattered like frightened birds. Panic swelled, choking him. He tugged at the restraints binding his wrists, cold metal biting into his skin. Chains. He was chained. Gary struggled against the restraints, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Each movement sent a jolt of pain through his arms, but he couldn't stop. He had to get free. He had to see. The darkness was a living thing, suffocating him, driving him mad. He screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed in the vast emptiness. Silence answered him. It was a silence so profound, so complete, it was more terrifying than any sound. Gary slumped back against the cold, damp walls, despair washing over him. He was trapped, alone, forgotten. The cold seeped into his bones, a constant gnawing ache. He was sitting on a hard, dirt floor. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. He was in some kind of enclosed space, the air stagnant and stale. A bomb shelter? The thought surfaced through the fog of pain and fear. Days? Weeks? How long had he been here? Time had lost all meaning. He existed in a perpetual state of darkness and pain, punctuated by the occasional visits from his captor. He didn't know the man's name. He had only caught fleeting glimpses of him, a tall, gaunt figure with eyes like chips of ice. The man would bring him food, bland, tasteless, gruel and water. He never spoke, never offered any explanation for Gary's imprisonment. His silence was more terrifying than any threat. Gary shuddered. He was a plaything, a prisoner in some twisted game he didn't understand. A sound. Footsteps. Light, brief and blinding, sliced through the darkness. Gary squeezed his eyes shut against the sudden assault. Here. A voice, young, almost hesitant. It wasn't the icy voice of his captor. This voice was different. Gary forced his eyes open. He blinked, trying to focus. A young man stood before him, his face obscured by the shadows. He couldn't have been more than 18, his features still boyish. He held out a metal tray, food. Who are you? Gary croaked, his voice raspy from disuse. The young man, Jesse, he'd said his name was Jesse, hesitated. Just someone who brought you food. Why am I here? Gary pressed, desperation clawing at his throat. What does he want? Jesse's eyes darted nervously towards the entrance. He glanced back at Gary, his face unreadable. Eat, he muttered, setting the tray down. Then he was gone, swallowed once more by the darkness. Hope, a fragile flicker in the suffocating darkness. Jesse, he was different. Maybe, just maybe, he could be Gary's way out. He had to try. He waited, counting the agonizingly slow crawl of time until he heard Jesse's footsteps again. Jesse, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The young man stopped, his silhouette a dark outline against the faint light. Help me, Gary pleaded. Please, you have to help me. Silence. Then a soft clinking sound. Jesse was closer now. Gary could hear his hesitant breaths. I can't, Jesse whispered, his voice trembling. You can, Gary insisted. He could sense Jesse's uncertainty, his fear. The keys, Jesse, they're right there. Jesse's breath hitched. Gary held his breath, every muscle in his body taut. The sound of metal scraping against metal. The chains fell away with a heavy thud. Go, Jesse hissed, now. Gary didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, his legs numb from disuse, and stumbled towards the exit, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out. He had to get help. But as he reached the foot of the stairs, a hand clamped down on his shoulder, spinning him around. Jesse's face, pale and terrified, loomed before him. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice choked with fear. I'm so sorry.